this out a little bit later as we talk more. I was on a panel last Saturday in Durham talking about the work that's been done on death row, and the people that do it, and there were people there from the Center for Death Penalty Litigation that represent folks on death row, and we were talking mainly about that. And when it came time for the Q&A, a lady stood up and told us a story about her nephew who was murdered in November. So that's very close. And she told it in tears. I mean, it was all she could do to get it out. And when she first started talking, I'm like, I don't know where this is going, because we've been talking about people that have killed people, and she's talking about somebody that got killed. But she was speaking out of a heart that was full of gratitude and compassion for people that have gratitude and compassion for other people. And one of my responses sometime after she told her story was that for every story that we have heard about a death row inmate, there are victims on the other side of that, right? So we have to acknowledge all of that. And one thing that I love about the work that we get to do is that we don't just work with people that have offended, but we work with victims that have received that pain. And so it is very gratifying to do that work. And one of my best friends in the world right now is a woman named Linda Simmons, whose son was murdered in Wilmington in 2004. And she found me through another great friend of mine named Scott Bass, who talked to her about victim offender dialogue. And so Linda and I had a conversation. We would see each other 2 or 3 times a year at various events for about the next 3 years. And I told her the first time I met her, when you get to a point that you feel like you might be ready for this, just let me know. So after about 3 years, she said, I think I'm ready. So we started walking down that path of victim offender dialogue to let her have some dialogue with a man that had killed her son. And we've done an awful lot of things together. And what I said a while ago is she has become one of my very best friends. I have a hard time with boundaries, and anybody that knows me knows that's a very true statement. Everybody up here is smiling, looking at me smiling, because they know that's a very true statement. And one thing that Kay Prentice said in a case that I use all the time, when she was talking to Sujatha Balaga, who was facilitating dialogue in a murder case. And Sujatha was going to go stay with one of the families that she was facilitating with. And Sujatha was a lawyer, and her lawyer friends were saying, you can't cross that boundary. That's a boundary you can't cross. And Sujatha was talking to Kay Prentice about it. And Kay Prentice said, Sujatha, we're not creating boundaries. We're not interested in that. We're interested in the center. And I love that. And so I'm interested in the center. And quite frankly, I've got to build relationship to find the center. And so I've built a great relationship with Linda, and I owe her so much. Man, you get long answers from me, and I'm sorry about that, but and you get stories too. But that story has created one of the richest relationships that I have in my life. She also has furthered this work in ways that nobody could have imagined. And like I said, I'll talk a little bit more about her. And I've got a letter with me from Michael Braxton, who's on death row. And this is a letter that he wrote to Linda after he heard her story when she visited with us on death row. And it's a letter of empathy. He walked in the shoes that he was hearing her talk about. And it's made a tremendous difference in his life. He called into the panel last week in Durham, and he said, when I heard Linda's story, it was a life-changing experience for me. And it helped me to begin to have empathy and to have remorse and to be able to feel my feelings and not just keep that wall up that he had been taught to keep up so that he could cope with it. So anyway, that's my long answer. We were told that we were becoming too familiar with the guys in our circle on death row. But what Mr. Moose had asked us to do was to bring humanity into the place. He's at the top level. Because he said, I know that our prisons are going to be safer communities if we can do that. So that's what we want you to do, and that's what you do. I'm like, awesome. Well, that message doesn't necessarily transfer to the boots on the ground. And so we never felt welcome until kind of close to the end when we got a programmer that came in with us that's amazing. And he's part of the reason that we've expanded from 1 to 3. But we got word that we were becoming a little too familiar, and we were given strict instructions. No more words of affirmation. No more, I love you, man. No more touching, not shaking hands, not fist bumping, not patting on the back, not nothing. I've never been so angry in my life. I was coming unglued. And Monica has known me in these deep and intense situations for a lot of years, and she was in the circle. That's why she started shaking and hanging her head a while ago when you were asking the question. She saw me coming unglued. So I was failing at what you were asking about. And I didn't understand it until 3 weeks later when one of my students had the opening. And you know what she did the opening on? The love languages. And it clicked in my mind. The reason I was so mad is because they had taken away my love language. My love language is about all I got. If I can't use my love language, I can't be who I think God has created me to be. They had taken it away from me. And it helped me so much to have an understanding of that. That helped me to work through it and get out of it. I was ready to burn the place down and quit. And Monica and my students were afraid of that. I really was. But it helped me understand, well, this is really not about me. And so that was a failure for a while on my part. I wasn't riding my lawnmower enough during that period of time because the grass wasn't growing during that period of time. But the student that talked about the love languages, and it was the process that helped get me back, because we share, as Val said, we share the opening every week. And so her doing that really helped me to come back to where I needed to be. By the way, Monica's got one of the most beautiful openings I've ever heard. I hope that she's a beautiful redhead sitting right behind you there. I hope that you'll tap into her while you've got a chance during a break sometime to get her to tell you a little bit about her story.
How have you guys experienced that shifting sand of knowing how to validate without, losing one's identity, and or where's that gray zone for you?
I mean, I think a big part of how we validate is by listening to one another. So I don't want to oversimplify.
No, I just wanted your answer. I was
Yeah, I mean, especially in the circle work, it is saying that we are creating an intentional space to hear your story, whatever the prompts is, whatever we are talking about that day. And we're not necessarily, there to unpack it or for the responsibility as the facilitator necessarily to kind of unpack that. And this is definitely things that I've learned over time. I started off, as a mediator as well, and I think I developed a lot of skills in, active listening and reflective listening and reframing and that sort of thing. But that's actually very little of what we're doing in the circle work. I think one of the incredibly validating and affirming experience of sharing space and being in circle with one another and taking the responsibility off of the facilitator is that it does it's the group's work to figure out how to proceed in any way, right? And so somebody might share something and I might have a really strong feeling about it, but it's not my turn to talk, or it's 3 people down, and the talking piece hasn't gotten to me yet. And maybe by the time it gets to the person next to me, somebody else has already sort of shared their story, which somehow also, or shared their answer to the prompt, which somehow dealt with, what the other person has said. And so there's just this equality of shared experience that I think is validating in and of itself. I mean, y'all know this, right? In our culture, American culture, we just don't have enough intentional space to, what was it you were saying about the ability to make mistakes and to just work through that and just hear each other. I mean, we're supposed to be okay all the time, perfect all the time, right? And so I think sharing space where we can say the wrong thing and we're still going to show up the next time, that's pretty valid. I mean, that's validating, right? It is for me. I mean, I really had to unlearn And that was again part of my healing and transformative process too, is a lot of the unlearning and unpacking myself, like all the layers that had built up on me over time. And what was I bringing into the room that might be impacting others. And so this is probably like literally the most talking I have done in months. I mean, like I say that to say that I really just listen most of the time now. And then I think there's this, if any folks are familiar with like the Quaker tradition, is like you speak when you feel led, right? Well, in circle, you're going to speak when you get the talking piece. You can't just speak when you feel led. But it is, this idea of you speak what's coming up for you in that moment, and you've created the values and guidelines together of how you want to share space. And so if you've said this is our intention of how we want to share space together, and the talking piece comes to you, there is, with practice, it becomes this very brave space to just be your fully human, authentic self, which includes getting messy and messing up and making mistakes too.
How do you approach the work, the circle dialogue in prisons with the different groups? So death row versus someone that may be released in a year. And so is there a different approach to how you lead that? And maybe everyone knows that, so you can just say, hey, there's a chapter I made. But yeah, I mean, it seems to me that as you're sort of bringing yourself into that situation and trying to prepare for that day, that it would seem that there's a very different technique potentially, or a different approach. I don't know. Or is it the same and you're still working through that process?
Our approach has been largely the same. Would you agree with that, Monica?
It's tailored, but the same.
I mean, I know we've used the same orientation sheet, whether we've been on death row or in the general population or down at the federal prison in Butner. We do the same elements of circle. We run, we have an opening, we have a check-in, we use a talking piece, we share coming in and doing openings and talking about talking pieces. There's internal work where we get to talk about our own stuff. You're invited, everything's always an invitation, you're invited to talk about your own life and what brought you to this point. You're also invited to talk about the event that got you incarcerated. And most of the time, there's not an event, there's a series of events that got you incarcerated. We bring survivors with us into the space, whether we're on death row or whether we're in the general population, because we think there's an opportunity for empathy building there that maybe has not happened before. When you hear from someone who has suffered similarly to people that you have made suffer. And the folks that we bring in are loving, caring, compassionate people. They don't walk in the door with hatred. And that's a surprise to a lot of people. That's part of what's in this letter that I brought with me today, is the surprise that Michael had when he heard from Linda Simmons. So it's largely the same, and I do think the effect depends on the person. Because I think we largely do the same thing no matter where we are. I think the effect largely depends on the person and their own circumstances. If we do the same thing, it's going to hit everybody in the room a little bit differently depending on who you are and what you've been through. So I guess I would just, Val has been a part of a lot of these circles. Monica's been part of a lot of these circles. I guess I would just ask Val what her thoughts are on that.
I think that I agree that the basics and the premise of what we're going to do is going to be the same. I do think if we're getting to sit with the same folks over a period of time and longer, like so for instance, I'm going to have the honor to sit with guys starting next week that have already gone through the 3-month original circles, and now we're going to be doing it again. So we will use different prompts. We are going to have some different kind of focusing activities than what we would do kind of working in the first kind of series of circles, since these guys have already done it before. Again, we're going to have some more focusing on what does it mean what does reconciliation mean, and apology and forgiveness, and actually more of how can you learn to keep circle, and more techniques and things like that. But as far as I mean, I will say, John, I've noticed that, you know, because I have been a part of the ones we've done, the general population and the death row now. I have noticed in some of, you know, when you're working in, I don't think our preparation is so much different as facilitators, but I think it is different for the guys. I mean, I've only sat in circle with guys. I know that y'all have also done the women's prison too, but for the guys, it's different because they are preparing how that they are going to be released. And so some of their conversations naturally go more towards what's it going to look like on the outside, and how can I maybe you know, how can I, what are the relationships going to be when I get out? And so that, I think it just more naturally goes to that, but not really from a facilitation
Right.
point. Is that?
Yeah.
One of the things I thought of with your comments is you're kind of, if I'm summarizing correctly, you were talking about like, you always feel like we're always in circle together. Like that's kind of how we're always kind of just to be. And I think we reflect that in our, how much we talk about some of the values, or we kind of use like a restorative justice compass to kind of see where we're at. And it's the idea of like, that every person is worthy and relational. You know, and that's kind of like the core, and that's everywhere. That's not just when you're in a certain dialogue together about something, but like everyone is worthy and relational, and that everyone deserves dignity. Everyone, we should work with each other with, I think, mutual concern and respect for everyone. And so like those are kind of some of our guiding values, no matter what we're doing, kind of just this blanket type process. And so that's one of the ways we kind of think about that. Is like I want, you know, the people that we work with, like that, all of our volunteers and circle people and staff members to be feeling that themselves, and then being able to go out and live that with the people they're working with. But as you asked the question, I was thinking like recently in two separate situations that we're dealing with is where we're being invited to go into places that don't operate that way, and how frustrating that is, because like we did a training this past week with a place where they're kind of checking off a box. Like they want us to come in because they're supposed to do restorative justice training, and they're checking off the box. And we went in and we kind of did this training. And from the beginning, like it's just kind of this little 2-hour training, but felt very much like it was really hard just to do the work because the leadership that was there just kind of felt, I don't know, they just felt like they didn't really need this work, they're just doing it. And so I didn't really, it's definitely one I've been reflecting on. So like the last trip, like we did it yesterday, and I've been thinking about it ever since, and like things that didn't go well, so like reflecting on that, and I was like, what could I have done differently to be better about meeting them where they're at? So I don't have an answer on that one. And the other one is a school that we're working with where they're asking us to come in, and like the principal is very punitive. But the staff is open and wanting to learn, and so we're caught in this thing where we can't get the principal on board, but there are staff on board, and so we're kind of like, how do we work with that? Because he kind of undermines all, like he'll come in and change things at the end, and so we're kind of like, we put all this work into something only to have it shut down. So I'm not sure, like I know that's not an answer to your question, I'm just sharing struggles because it's helpful to share struggles. And so, yeah, that's kind of where we're at, like what do we do when we're invited into spaces that are not holding those same values, and where we don't have the power to change that. And so I guess part of it is just living out our values, sticking true to our values and staying true there, and not trying to go outside of our values with how we want to respond.
Can I add I was going to say too, oh my gosh, yes, about sharing that struggle. But I think also it's, and this is, again, really developed for me, because this is so much, I think I mentioned it a little bit, like so much unlearning for me of what, of the society that I grew up in, right? But I think our idea is one of the reasons we practice intentional circles and circle keeping is then to take the spirit of the circle out, right? So like if we can be intentional about it, and we can learn this, and we can learn how to really listen, and we can learn how to share space with each other, the idea is that will ripple out, right? So that we are being healed, and as we go out into the world, we can be, healers as well, maybe wounded healers, but we're headed out into the world with that spirit of the circle as well. And I think, and I know we've talked about this before, it used to be a lot of like knocking on doors. Yeah, that's very RJ. Knocking on doors and saying, hey, listen about this awesome stuff that we want to tell you about it. We want to share RJ with you and restorative practices. And I've definitely just kind of like really pulled back from that now and having a more kind of, I guess faith is the right, I mean, like, I guess it's a faith of like, okay, there are folks who share the values. There are folks that want to do this work, or I mean, we call it work, but just want to live. That's what I appreciate about your question, because that takes kind of like the work piece out of it. And it's like who want to live this valued, kind of life, right, and shared values. And so, and one of the primary tenets, in restorative practices is really that participation is voluntary. Right? Like, we don't want to force this on anyone. And so, I mean, we can tell you some really cool stuff and like how it's impacted us and some of the people that we've gotten to share space with. And you know what? That's not your thing? Okay. Like, instead of trying to force people. And that has really released some of that pressure. And also what you were talking about too, like self-care, of like not trying to force folks into it, has really helped me care for myself a little bit. And knowing that almost the more that I do that, the more people are asking for it and wanting to like know how to be involved in this shared valued life and work. And that's just been like, that's one of those things that, I'm sitting in a room full of people who are really interested. Like sometimes like it's difficult for me to talk about things like that, but I feel like I can just kind of share that openly, with this group of folks. It's just been a really beautiful unfolding that the more we've shared space like this, the more spaces are becoming available to share space like this.
All of you mentioned juveniles, and there's this kind of push in the restorative justice field, like, oh, well, that only works for juveniles, right? Which is one of the struggles I know you've all fought against. You all mentioned it. So I'm just kind of curious, like, and you also talked about it as a movement, right? Which I think it is, right? And I'm just, so, and maybe your closing is around this, I don't know, but like, how, kind of following up on what you just said, Mel, like, how do you, because it is voluntary, but how do you get those people, that principal at the school who is punitive and like, that'll never work, right? Because, I mean, we work in a school where that was similar, maybe not as similar now because we have a new principal, but certainly our previous principal was like that. So I don't know, yeah, any ideas, any thoughts on how we can fill those gaps, how we can push the movement forward?
Right.
We need to shame people sometimes. I'm only half kidding when I say that. We often meet with principals that are skeptical, but and normally it doesn't start with the principal inviting us in. It starts with a counselor attending an orientation and saying, oh my God, we got to have this. And I say, well, go back and talk to your leadership and see if you can get us invited. And so that'll almost always happen. And so we ask to meet with the leadership team and the counselor, others that may be champions for the work. And I just surprise them. I bring my talking piece. And I talk about the two main tools that we use, which are facilitated dialogue, which is the method to resolve conflict, and circle process, which is the method to build community and relationship. And I tell them the story behind my talking piece, and this is a pretty special one for me. This teddy bear is called OC. He was made for us by a man named O.C. Billings at Butner Federal, who was in our circle. And he came in one day and he had a little piece of paper, and he said, I want all of y'all to write your name and a special thing about circle on your piece of paper and give it back to me. So we did that, and he crumpled them up like he was going to throw them away. We're like, what you doing, man? He said, I'm making something. The next week he walks in and he says, I've learned how to crochet while I've been in prison, which had been a substantial amount of time. It would take me forever to learn how to crochet. He said, I have crocheted this teddy bear, and I want to make it as a gift to y'all as a talking piece. And your pieces of paper with your name and your special thing are on the inside. Well, that's just an example that talking pieces are not just pieces of something. They're pieces of us, and they're pieces of other people. And we always tell the story before we introduce the talking piece. So I'll tell that story, and I'll say the reason I brought this one is because there is a connection between the punitive measures that are being used in schools and OC Billings being in prison. And we want to break the connection. And then I'll say, let me offer you my getting acquainted question that I love. Tell us about your relationship with your hair, and we'll pass the talking piece. And that's a surprise. And they always go, my what? I say, yeah, your hair. It's just a great way to start on kind of a lighthearted and fun thing, but it reveals a lot. So I always try to bring in the skeptic. When we did our first death row circle, first day, they sent in a corrections officer to be with us. She sat in the corner, and before we started, I said, one of our general rules about circle is if you're in the room, you're in the circle. Would you like to pull your chair up and join our circle? She was so uncomfortable, but she was polite enough not to refuse my invitation, and she joined the circle. And she very uncomfortably participated for those 2 hours. And we never saw her again. Which was okay. But I think she must have gone back and she said, this is not threatening. I don't think we need security in the room. And we did have a psychologist, a person who worked on a psychology team that was with us every time. But we did our first circles without COs in the room. I guess my point is, I do think you need leadership on board. If your principal is not on board, you are not going to get very far in that school. But I like for them to participate. I think if you can experience it, that is much better than me telling you about it. So that's my method.
Yeah, it's the same. Embrace skepticism, understand why they're feeling the way that they're feeling, listen to them, and yes, I used to start off with presentations in schools, and I don't anymore. We go straight into let's get to know each other and do exactly what John just said.
And so, yeah, I think the recognition that it's a journey for people, and so accepting where they are on the journey, and giving them the space to learn. That one. I mean, with this one principal at the school, we can't even get him to come to the meetings in the first place. So like, we were just like, give us an opportunity. I think you would like it, but he won't even come. So, yeah.
That's the hard stuff.
I'm probably not going to read this because I think it would take a little too much time. But let me tell you where you can hear this read. You can hear it read by Linda Simmons. If you'll go to YouTube and search her name, Linda Simmons, Lynda Simmons. She did a talk at Camel that we recorded, and she read Elaine's letter as part of that talk, so you can hear it from her own mouth.